Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to walk students through the study of the first 5 verses of St. Jerome's translation of the Gospel of St. John from Greek into Latin. This lesson is studied in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Latin Reading 1 course, and if you're enrolled in that course, you'll find that there are other resources available to introduce you to Latin reading, including a pronunciation guide and other brief introductory information about the Latin reading course. In this video, though, we're going to jump right into the study of John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. And again, this is the Latin translation of the original Greek writing of St. John, translated by St. Jerome in the 4th century of the Christian era. What we'll do in these lessons is read through the text, then go through and translate each word one by one, and then reassemble the translations into English so that you can learn the meaning of every word in the text in every verse. And we'll study the first 5 chapters in Latin Reading 1. So let's begin at verses 1 through 5 of chapter 1 in the Gospel according to St. John. What I'll do to begin is read all 5 verses and ask that you simply listen and follow along to hear the pronunciation and get used to the sounds of Latin reading. If you don't have the text in front of you, I recommend you pause the video, go find the text, and then come back and play the video so you can listen and follow along looking at your text. All right, so you can pause the video now if you'd like, and when you're ready, come back and we'll get started. Verses 1 through 5 of chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. John. We read, "In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum." Verse 2. Hoc erat in principio apud Deum. Verse 3. Omnia per ipsum facta sunt, et sine ipso factum est nihil quod factum est. Verse 4. In ipso vita erat, et vita erat lux hominum. Verse 5. Et lux in tenebris lucet, et tenebrae eam non comprehenderunt. This is the reading of verses 1 through 5 of chapter 1 of the Gospel of St. John, translated by St. Jerome. You can play that back and listen to the reading as much as you'd like to help you learn the pronunciation. We'll cover all of the sounds and all of the different pronunciations in our reading, so there's no real need for formal pronunciation study. You'll pick that up as we go along. Now what I'd like to do is walk through each of those 5 verses, studying the translation of the Latin into our English word by word. It's common in translation for translators to try and capture the ideas and translate into a sort of modern living English language. But in Latin reading, we don't want to do that. What we want to do is keep everything in the exact word order and translate as literally as possible. Because remember, when these Latin speakers spoke or wrote or were reading things, they received these words in this order. As the words were spoken or as they were read, the minds of the hearers received the words in this order that we see in the text. And so we really don't want to translate it into a modern English. Rather, we want to learn to think in the same way, in the same order that the original Latin and Greek speakers did when they communicated using these classical languages. If we learn to bring our English as students, and this just refers to us as students, if we learn to think in terms of the classical word order, it'll help us greatly to learn these classical languages. So we're not going to take the verse and then translate it into our own language so it sounds like normal modern English. We're going to translate word for word and learn to translate literally so that the word by word translation makes sense in English, rather than translating it sloppily and having to retranslate it into English that makes some sense. There's too many steps in that kind of translation. We want to stick closely to the text and translate literally, word for word. And if what we say in our translation doesn't make any sense, it's a sign that our translation isn't very good. So let's look at the text now and discuss the translation word by word, maintaining the original order of the words and ideas as they appear in the Latin text. In verse 1, we read, "In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum." That's verse 1. We begin with the phrase in principio. In principio. In is a preposition. In English, it translates as in. Principio is a substantive noun. If you look up the word principio in a Latin dictionary, you won't find it. You have to know what the nominative case is for this noun. It's principium. So if you look it up in a dictionary, you'll need to look up principium. Principio is a certain form or case of the noun principium. It's the oblative case, and it's in the oblative case or oblative form because it follows and is related to the preposition in. In principio means in beginning. In beginning. Now, in Latin, there are no articles. In English, we use articles to clarify our speech. We say a person, the person. A, an, and the are called articles. There are no articles in Latin. So when we read in beginning, that's a literal translation. But in English, we would say in the beginning. But there's no article in Latin. So we can stick to the text literally and say in beginning, or we can say in the beginning. But if we add the in our translation, you should always put it in parentheses to remind yourself that that word isn't actually in the Latin text. Okay? So we can translate in beginning or in the beginning with the in parentheses. In principio, in the beginning. Erat is a verb. It means was. In the beginning was verbum. Verbum means word. It's another substantive noun. It means word. In principio erat verbum. In the beginning was the word. Et verbum erat apud Deum. Et verbum erat apud Deum. Et is a conjunction. It means and. Et verbum, and the word erat, the same verb we saw before, was apud Deum. Apud is another preposition, like in. Apud means with. Apud, though, is not followed by the ablative case, like in was. It's followed by the accusative case. and we see apud deum. If you look up deum in the dictionary, you won't find it. You have to look up the nominative form, which is deus, D-E-U-S. Deum is a form or case of the noun deus. It's the accusative case because it follows the preposition apud. Apud deum means with God. And then we read et deus erat verbum, and God erat was verbum. Now in that last phrase, you see et deus erat verbum. And literally, word by word, that means and God was the Word. However, if you look in a Catholic Bible like the Douay-Rheims Bible, or any Bible, any Bible translation in English, you'll see that it doesn't say, and God was the Word, but it says, and the Word was God. It changes the word order. It flips Deus and Verbum. It says Verbum first and Deus last. Why does it do that? The reason why is because in this sentence, the subject is actually verbum. Word order can move around in English translation, but the idea of this first verse has verbum as the subject, and therefore Deus erat verbum literally in the original word order means and God was the Word. But because verbum is the subject of the sentence, in English we normally put the subject first, and that's why in English translation those words are flipped. But what we'd like to learn to keep the original word order is in principio erat verbum. In the beginning was the Word. Et verbum erat apud Deum. And the Word was with God. Et Deus erat verbum. And God was the Word. The reason we want to maintain that original word order is because we're going to study these verses using translation exercises. We want to be able to translate the Latin text into English one word at a time. And then we want to be able to take our English translation and translate it back into Latin one word at a time. So we want the word order of our English translation to match the original word order of St. John's or St. Jerome's Latin translation. Okay, so keep the words in their original order for the sake of our academic work. Okay, if you were making a Bible for use in the church or for study by Christian people, there's rules for how translation and interpretation works. But this is an academic study, and in our academic studies, we want to maintain a strict word order for the sake of our translation exercises. Okay? So that's verse 1. Let's go on to verse 2. Verse 2 reads, Hoc erat in principio apud Deum. Hoc erat in principio apud Deum. The first word in the sentence, hoc, is a pronoun. It translates as this. Now, because it's a pronoun, it stands in place of some noun. And so the first question we need to ask is, what noun does hoc stand in place of? Hoc, if we look it up in a dictionary, again, we won't find it because it's a form of a pronoun, and the form that's listed in the dictionary is not the same form that's here in our reading. This pronoun hoc comes from a pronoun hic. So if you were to look up in a dictionary the pronoun hic, you would find hic, hic, hoc. And here is the form we see in our reading, hoc. This is the masculine form of the pronoun, this is the feminine form of the pronoun, and this is a neuter form of the pronoun. Hic, hic, hoc. That's the form we see in our reading. And if you look up that pronoun in a dictionary, you'll find that it translates as this or the same. But we'll use the same in this translation. But what does it refer to? It's a pronoun, so it has to stand in place of some noun. What noun does it stand in place of? Well, because it's the neuter form of the pronoun, we can know that it stands in place of a neuter noun. Now, in verse 1, we saw a couple of nouns. We saw deus and we saw verbum. Deus is a masculine noun. Verbum is a neuter noun. And so it helps us to see that hoc is not standing in place of deus, because that would need to be a masculine pronoun. It would be hic. Hoc, because it's neuter, must stand in place of a neuter noun, and that would be verbum. So the gender, the form of the pronoun, helps us to understand what that pronoun is standing in place of. So in verse 2, hoc, we can translate it as this. It refers back to verbum, or the same. This, referring to verbum, erat, was, in principio, in the beginning, apud Deum, with God. In verse 2, the only word you need to learn is hoc. All the other words are from verse 1, repeated. So hoc erat in principio apud Deum. This, erat, was, in principio, in the beginning, apud Deum. That's verse 2. On to verse 3. Omnia per ipsum facta sunt, et sine ipso factum est nihil, quod factum est. The first word we see is omnia. And once again, if you were to look this up in a dictionary, you wouldn't find it. You would have to look up the nominative singular form, which is omnis, and you would see that omnis means every. Omnia, the form that we see here in our reading, is neuter and plural. And so rather than every, which refers to individual things, we're going to use a plural translation. All. Omnia. All. And because it's neuter, we're going to translate it as all things. Omnia. All things. Per ipsum. Per ipsum. Per, like in and apud, is another preposition, one of the 8 parts of speech. Per is a preposition that means through or by. So per ipsum. Ipsum is a pronoun. Make some room here. Ipsum is a pronoun, and if you look it up in a dictionary, you won't find it, because it's a form. It's a form of the pronoun ipse. Per ipsum. Ipsum is in the accusative case. Per ipsum means through him. All things through him. Facta sunt. Facta means made, like in English we have a factory, a place where things are made, a factory. Manufacture means to make by hand. Manu comes from the Latin manus, which means hand, and facture comes from factus, which means made. Manufactured means made by hand. Omnia, all things, per ipsum, by him or through him, facta sunt. Facta means made, sunt means are. Sine ipso. Sine is another preposition. Ipso is another form of this pronoun. Ipse, ipsa, ipsum. Ipso is a pronoun that means him. So sine, ipso, the preposition sine means without, and ipso means him. Without him, sine ipso, factum est nihil. Factum is another form of facta. So we have factus, facta, factum. This is the singular neuter form. And in the plural, factum becomes facta. So facta is plural, factum is singular. We saw facta sunt, are made, or made are. Here we see sine ipso, without him, factum est, singular. Made is nihil. And nihil means nothing. Omnia per ipsum, all things through him, facta sunt, made are. Et sine ipso, and without him, factum est nihil, made is nothing. Quod factum est. Quod is a pronoun. If you look it up in a dictionary, the masculine form of the pronoun is qui. Qui, que, quod. Quod is the pronoun we see here. Sine ipso factum est nihil, made is nothing. Quod, it means which or that. Factum est, that made is. So the translation, all things through him made are, and without him made is nothing, that made is. That's the translation for verse 3. Moving on to verse 4. In ipso vita erat, et vita erat lux hominum. In ipso means in him. We already saw per ipsum. We already saw sine ipso. Here we see another phrase with a preposition and a form of this pronoun ipse. In ipso, in him. Vita. Vita is a noun that means life. If a person goes to the hospital, if there's some kind of accident, the nurses will check the person's vital signs. Signs of life. Vita is life. In ipso, in him, vita, life, erat, was. Et, and, vita, the life, erat, was, lux. Lux is another noun. It means light. Lux, light. And hominum, hominum is a form of the noun homo, which means man. Homo, if you look it up in a dictionary, means man. Hominum is the genitive plural form of homo. It translates as of men. Of men. In ipso vita erat. In him life was. Et vita erat lux hominum. And the life that was in him, erat lux hominum, was the light of men. That's verse 4. And this brings us to verse 5. Et lux in tenebris lucet. Et lux in tenebris lucet. Et lux, and the light, in tenebris. In tenebris. Now this is a little bit of a tricky word. Tenebris. If we look it up in a dictionary, we'll find tenebra is the singular form. in verse 5, we're going to see two forms. We're going to see tenebrai or tenebrae, and we're going to see tenebris. Both of these are plural. Tenebrae and tenebris are both plural forms of this noun, tenebra. This noun, what it means, literally, is shade or shadow, tenebra. And this expression, in the plural, we could think of it as the shadows. The shadows. But what it really expresses is our idea, our English idea, of darkness. Darkness. So, et lux, and the light, in tenebris. In tenebris. In the shadows, or in the darkness, lucet, shines. Lucet is a verb that means to shine. Et lux in tenebris lucet, and the light in the darkness shines. Et tenebrae, and the darkness, eam. Eam is another pronoun. You will not find it in your dictionary. If you look up eam in a dictionary, you won't find it. You have to know the grammar. Eam is a form of the pronoun is, ea, id, which translates as he, she, it. It's a pronoun. Is in Latin means he, ea means she, id means it. Eam is a form of ea. So eam is a feminine pronoun. Now, we haven't talked about any women, so why would we be using a feminine pronoun? Well, the noun lux, which we saw, which is the subject of this sentence, lux, if you look up lux in a dictionary, you'll find that the gender of the noun lux is feminine. And so if you're going to use a pronoun in place of the noun lux, since lux is a feminine noun, we need to use a feminine pronoun. And that's why we have eam here in verse 5. Et lux in tenebris lucet, and the light in the darkness shines. Et tenebrae, and the darkness, eam. So we're not going to translate it as she, because it doesn't refer to a woman. We're going to translate it as it, because it refers to light. And in English, we refer to anything that's not a person as it. We refer to men as he, we refer to women as she, and anything else we refer to as it. So even though it has a feminine form, the translation of eam here in verse 5 is going to be it. And the darkness, it, non comprehenderunt. The word non is an adverb, and it translates as not in English. Not comprehenderunt. And comprehenderunt is a plural verb because it refers back to tenebrae, which is plural, even though in English the translation appears singular, darkness. We have to remember that in Latin, tenebrae is a plural noun, so the verb is also going to be plural. Comprehenderunt means they did comprehend or take hold of. And non comprehenderunt means they did not comprehend. They did not take hold of it. They refers back to tenebrae. We translate tenebrae as darkness. So even though we have a plural verb, in English, we're going to have a singular translation. That's a little confusing. And that's why I say It's usually better in academic studies to keep things as literal as possible. So in an ideal world in school for our Latin studies, we would say, and the light in the shadows shines, and the shadows it not did comprehend. That would make more perfect sense of the Latin. But in English, we'll see, and the light in the darkness shines, and the darkness it not did comprehend. So that's our translation of verse 5, and now we've translated all of the first 5 verses in chapter 1. Now, I've included a lot of grammatical information that I don't expect you to know as you're studying in Latin Reading 1. In Latin Reading 1, it's assumed that you're working and getting started in Latin Grammar 1. And if you're not, you should be. You should be studying Latin Grammar 1 before or while you study Latin Reading 1. I'm going to comment on the grammar to explain everything to you, but you're not going to need all of this grammatical information on your lesson assessments. On the lesson assessments, you're only going to need to know the vocabulary, the translation of each word into English. So relax as we go through these videos. Just listen and learn to anything I share about the grammar of what we're reading. But you're going to need to study and master the vocabulary, not all of this grammatical information. And all of that is written in your lesson. So studying is pretty easy. Enjoy the grammar, study the vocabulary. All right? So we've studied verses 1 through 5. What you need to do now to study this is use translation exercises to master the translation of these verses. You should copy out the Latin text onto a sheet of lined paper. Copy it out, write the Latin, skip a line, and continue writing out the Latin, skipping a line after each line of Latin. Then go back, use your lesson to help you translate word for word through verses 1 through 5. And continue to repeat that exercise until you can write out the English translation without looking at your lesson for help. So you should continue to repeat that exercise. Copy out the Latin, write the English translation. Copy out the Latin, write the English translation, one word at a time. Look at your lesson anytime you forget what a word means. Study the words, learn the vocabulary. Continue drilling and drilling and drilling using the translation exercise until you can write out the English translation without looking at your lesson. Flip it in the other direction and do the same thing. After you've written out your word-by-word English translation, take another sheet of paper and write out that English translation. Then translate every English word or phrase into the original Latin word. Look at your lesson for help when you need it, and continue drilling that exercise until you can go from English back into the Latin without any need to look at your lesson or without making any mistakes. If you use those translation exercises, you'll get through these lessons most quickly. Many students don't trust me when I tell them that, and they try to turn this into a vocabulary study where all that they do is sit and try to memorize the lists of words. That may make sense when you're getting started. But what's going to happen over time is you're going to learn that if you would do the translation exercises, it is the fastest way to learn. Don't let yourself think that what helps you get through lesson 1 is the best way. It's not. I'm telling you, as the teacher, to use translation exercises to complete the lessons in Latin Reading 1. And that's what you should do. When you can write out the translation without looking at your lessons, without any errors in your translations, and you can go from Latin into English and English into Latin, then you'll be ready for the assessment. You'll know all the vocabulary. You'll be ready for the assessment. Go take that quiz. You should get a high score, maybe even a perfect score. If you don't, go back and review, figure out what you had wrong, if you run into any trouble with your quizzes, let's say sometimes a student may have only 1 or 2 wrong and he can't figure out what he's getting wrong. That's when you should contact us and let us take a look at your results, see if there's a problem. Maybe it's just a spelling mistake. Maybe it's a mistake with our exam. Sometimes students enter acceptable answers and our answer key is simply looking for something a little bit different and it marks it wrong. So if you get to the point where you feel pretty confident that you know the material and you've got a couple wrong on your exam and you can't figure out what's wrong, that's when you should contact us. Let us take a look at your results and make sure there's not just some silly mistake keeping you back. But that's how you should study in Latin Reading 1. Make sure you're also working through Latin Grammar 1. And as we go, you'll understand more and more of the grammar. Now, in Latin Reading 2, we're going to read the writings of the Roman Cicero. And when we study Latin Grammar 2, or Latin Reading 2, when we study Latin Reading 2, I'm going to assume that you know the content of Latin Grammar 1. And so I'm going to do much more in terms of teaching and testing your knowledge of the grammar in Latin Reading 2, but not in Latin Reading 1. So study the vocabulary, use the translation exercises, and we'll go 5 verses at a time through the first 5 chapters of the Gospel of St. John, translated by St. Jerome. I hope that's a helpful guide to this first reading. Now it's time for you to study this lesson for mastery. As I said, using the translation exercises. If you need any help, get in touch with me by email or live chat if you're an enrolled student. And take the lesson assessment. If you have a couple wrong and run into some trouble, let me know. But if not, you'll be able to move along pretty easily through these lessons in Latin Reading 1. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.